July 4, 1945. The war in Europe was over, but the echoes of its violence lingered in unexpected places. In a fenced camp on American soil, beneath a wide summer sky heavy with smoke and dust, rows of German women prisoners sat on rough wooden benches. Their dresses were faded, their shoes worn thin, their eyes shadowed from months of uncertainty. They had been brought across the Atlantic not as honored guests, not even as defeated soldiers, but as captives whose roles during the war had tied them to the collapsing Reich. Many had served as clerks, nurses, auxiliaries, unarmed, yet part of the great machinery that had driven the German war effort. Now, stripped of purpose and homeland, they watched with wary eyes as the Americans prepared something that looked more like a carnival than a meal. The occasion was the American Independence Day, and the guards seemed intent on celebrating it with a strange sort of generosity. A line of steel drums had been dragged out and converted into makeshift grills. Flames snapped beneath iron grates, smoke curled into the air, and the smell of sizzling meat carried across the camp. The women leaned forward, noses wrinkling, whispering to one another in harsh, skeptical German. They recognized sausage when they saw it, but this? This was no proud bratwurst cooked over wood with a crusty bread roll at its side. These were pale, stubby things pulled from large tins, slapped onto soft white bread that looked too clean, too spongy to be real food. Hundeschlamm, one of the women muttered under her breath. Dog slop. The others laughed, a sharp sound that held both mockery and despair. It was easier to laugh at the Americans than to admit curiosity, easier to scorn than to allow hunger to betray them. These women had grown up in a country where bread was dark and dense, where sausage was spiced with care, where food, even in wartime, carried centuries of tradition. What they saw now looked insulting, a parody of a meal. Yet the smell, rich with fat and smoke, tugged at their empty stomachs despite their pride. Among them sat Marta, a 27-year-old nurse from Cologne. She had been captured in the final months of the war, swept up in a wave of surrender that brought entire auxiliary units into Allied hands. Marta's face bore the calm discipline of someone who had seen too much suffering to waste words on complaints, but inside she carried a restless bitterness. She had lost brothers to the Eastern Front, her home to Allied bombing, and now she sat in a foreign land forced to eat food she did not understand. She kept her eyes on the ground, though the smoke from the grills drifted toward her and filled her lungs with an unfamiliar hunger. The American guards were in high spirits. They laughed and joked, balancing plates stacked with the sausages and buns, passing around jars of mustard and ketchup. To them this was normal, the taste of summer, the very image of American life compressed into a single handheld meal. One soldier raised his hot dog high in mock salute, mustard dripping down his chin, and called across to the women in broken German, "Best Wurster Welt." The women shook their heads, some snorted with amusement, others turned away in disdain. To Marta the gesture seemed childish but also strangely human. These were not the brutal occupiers she had been told to expect. Still, the tension in the air was unmistakable. Pride was a fragile thing in captivity, and food could wound it as much as hunger. Marta thought of the rations back home, if one could call them that. In the final winter of the war, her family had survived on potatoes boiled in gray water, on bread stretched with sawdust, on cabbage so bitter it made her teeth ache. She remembered standing in line for hours for a single ladle of watery soup. And here, in the land of her captors, food seemed to spill from every corner, cheap and endless. The very sight of it made her uneasy. What did it mean that America could feed even its prisoners with such abundance? A guard approached the women's bench with a tray. He was young, barely older than Marta, his uniform sleeves rolled up, his face damp with sweat from the grills. He held out the tray with an awkward smile, as if embarrassed by his own offering. On it sat rows of hot dogs, sausages pressed into buns, smears of mustard shining in the afternoon light. The women stared as though he had placed rats before them. No one reached for the food. "Eat," the guard said in halting German. "Gut. Good food." Laughter rippled through the women. One of them, a tall blonde named Erika, leaned forward with a sneer. "Dog slop," she hissed loud enough for the guard to hear. The other women giggled, emboldened. Marta felt her lips twitch despite herself. There was something absurd about the scene, this boyish American offering food with a grin while a dozen German women mocked him in whispers. Yet the guard did not grow angry. He only shrugged, took one of the hot dogs for himself, and bit into it with exaggerated delight. The sound of his chewing, the gleam of grease on his lips, the careless joy with which he devoured the thing, it stirred something Marta did not expect. She realized how long it had been since she had seen anyone eat with pleasure, without fear of running out, without guilt. Food in Germany had become a rationed shadow, something to be hoarded, measured, resented. Here, food was abundance itself, and that abundance carried a weight she could not yet name. One by one, some of the women reached hesitantly for the hot dogs. Hunger was stronger than pride after all. Erika took hers with a look of disdain, sniffed it, then took a small, cautious bite. Her eyes widened. She covered her mouth as though she had betrayed herself, but the taste could not be denied. It was salty, smoky, strangely sweet, wrapped in bread so soft it dissolved on the tongue. Another woman followed, then another. Soon the tray was empty, save for the few Marta and a handful of others had refused. Marta sat still, her hands clasped in her lap, her hunger gnawing at her ribs. She wanted to resist, to hold on to dignity, but the smell would not leave her. She imagined biting into one of those absurd sausages, imagined the warmth spreading through her body, imagined the hollow ache in her stomach finally silenced. She turned her head to hide her expression, but she knew she would not resist much longer. The guard returned, another tray balanced in his hands. The women were quieter now, less mocking, their laughter replaced with a nervous energy. Some were already reaching out eagerly, ashamed yet unable to stop themselves. Marta glanced at Erika, who chewed with lips pressed tight, eyes flashing defiance even as grease shone on her fingers. Marta exhaled slowly. The war had taught her that dignity was fragile, that pride could not fill an empty stomach. She reached for the food, her fingers brushing the soft bread, the warmth of the sausage. For a moment she hesitated, aware that this was more than a bite of food. It was a step into a different reality, one where her enemies were not the monsters she had been told, and where the simplest of meals could carry the weight of an entire nation's abundance. She lifted it to her mouth, closed her eyes and bit down. The taste was not what she expected. It was not bratwurst, not the hearty sausage of her homeland, but something entirely its own, lighter, stranger, infused with a sweetness she could not place. She chewed slowly, her eyes opening to the sight of the guard watching her, waiting for her reaction. She swallowed, lowered the bun, and felt the corners of her mouth twitch upward, not quite a smile but not far from it. Around her, the women were eating, murmuring with astonishment, some giggling at their own hypocrisy. The guard laughed softly as if he had won a small battle without raising a weapon. Marta looked down at the hot dog in her hand and thought of everything she had lost, everything she had endured, and wondered what it meant that something so simple could taste like hope. She took another bite. And though she said nothing, the silence that followed was louder than any insult, for it carried the weight of realization. The world outside the fences was larger, stranger, and perhaps kinder than she had dared to imagine. The smoke curled higher into the summer sky, and somewhere beyond the camp, fireworks cracked faintly in the distance. It was Independence Day, but here in the camp, it felt like something else entirely, the beginning of an unexpected transformation, sparked by nothing more than bread, sausage, and the courage to taste what had once been mocked as dog slop. Marta had not expected the taste to linger in her mind. By the following morning she found herself thinking of it again. The soft bread, the strange sweetness, the smoky salt that clung to her lips long after the meal was over. She sat on the edge of her bunk with her arms folded, her eyes narrowed at nothing in particular, trying to decide whether it was shame she felt or something closer to relief. Around her, the other women murmured about the hot dogs in low voices, pretending not to care while their words betrayed them. They mocked the Americans still, but their ridicule carried a new edge, one sharpened by appetite. It was easier to sneer at something they secretly wished to taste again. The guards, perceptive in ways that surprised Marta, noticed this change. They were not scholars of the German language, but they understood laughter, tone, and body language. The next day, as if sensing an opportunity, they brought more. The scene repeated itself. Smoke rising from the grills, buns stacked in crates, jars of condiments lined up like soldiers on parade. This time, the women were quicker to accept, though not without remarks. Erika, who had once been the loudest in her derision, took two in quick succession, muttering, "At least it is better than cabbage water." Her words drew a ripple of laughter, but it was laughter laced with surrender, a recognition that pride could not keep pace with hunger. For Marta, the conflict was more complicated. She felt pulled in two directions. On one hand, her memories of Germany pressed against her conscience. The nights of rationing, the faces of her neighbors hollow with hunger, her mother scraping the last of the flour to make bread that crumbled in their hands. On the other, the hot dog represented not just food but a symbol, a reminder that America, the enemy, lived in abundance so vast that even its prisoners could taste it. That abundance gnawed at her, for it mocked the suffering she had endured, and yet it also fascinated her. A guard named Private Callahan became the unofficial host of these small feasts. He was lanky, dark-haired, with a crooked grin that never seemed to leave his face. His German was broken but enthusiastic, and the women quickly learned to both mock and rely on him. He had a habit of gesturing dramatically whenever he described the food, as though he were a stage actor performing for a reluctant audience. "This," he declared one afternoon, waving a hot dog aloft, "is freedom on bread." The phrase, mangled in translation, sent the women into fits of laughter. Freedom, to them, was the last word they would associate with captivity. Yet Marta watched Callahan closely. He did not laugh at them the way Erika did, nor did he pity them. He seemed genuinely invested in whether they enjoyed the food, as if their reaction meant something to him beyond amusement. It unsettled her. She had been raised to believe the enemy was cruel, merciless, a machine without compassion. But Callahan, sweating by the grill, tossing jokes into the air as though they were scraps of bread, did not fit that image. He looked like a boy who had wandered into war by mistake, trying to turn sausages into peace offerings. The women argued about the food in their barracks. Some insisted it was still an insult, scraps disguised as generosity. Others admitted, in whispers, that they preferred the hot dogs to the thin soup they had been given before. Erika was blunt: better to eat like Americans than starve like Germans. Marta did not answer. Her silence was her shield, though inside she wrestled with the same thought. The statistics the guard sometimes mentioned floated through her mind. 4,000 calories a day, that was what the average American soldier received. She had overheard one of them bragging. 4,000. More than 3 times what she had survived on in Cologne during the final months of the war. The number haunted her. It was not just food, it was power, wealth, a kind of security she had never known. Each bite of bread reminded her that her captors lived in a world untouched by the desperation that had defined hers. And yet, something else was happening. The act of eating together, however reluctantly, created a fragile thread between the women and the guards. It was impossible to sneer with true conviction while swallowing the very thing you mocked. Marta noticed how the guards lingered less at the fences now, how they smiled more freely, how their jokes were softer. Even the prisoners, though still proud, had begun to meet their eyes instead of turning away. Food, it seemed, was a language more fluent than words. One evening, Marta caught Callahan watching her as she ate. She looked up, startled, and found him grinning at her with that same crooked expression. He raised his own hot dog in mock salute, and though she wanted to scowl, she felt her lips twitch against her will. She lowered her gaze quickly, ashamed. It was dangerous to soften, dangerous to let the enemy appear human. But the taste on her tongue and the warmth in her stomach betrayed her. The central conflict now lay not in the food itself but in what it represented. To the women, eating it meant admitting that the Americans had something their homeland had failed to provide. It meant confessing, if only to themselves, that perhaps their captors lived in a world worth envying. For Marta, it meant confronting the gulf between her suffering and their abundance, between what she had been taught and what she now saw. Yet the irony could not be ignored. The same women who had mocked the hot dogs as dog slop were now discussing them with a seriousness once reserved for news from home. Erika even speculated aloud how they were made, guessing that the meat came from scraps, yet admitting that the flavor was unlike anything she knew. "If this is scraps," she said, "then America has better scraps than we ever had meals." The others nodded, reluctant but unable to disagree. The moment that solidified this shift came quietly. One afternoon, a younger woman named Liesel, no more than 19, bit into her hot dog and closed her eyes. Tears welled unbidden and she whispered, "It tastes like I am full." The others went silent at her words. No one mocked her. They all understood too well what it meant to eat without fear of the next ration, to feel full in a way they had not in years. For Marta, that moment was a turning point. She realized that the conflict was not about the food's quality but about dignity, memory, and what the meal forced them to confront. To eat was to admit that the world was larger than the ruins of their homeland, that abundance existed even when they had been taught to believe in scarcity. It unsettled her, but it also cracked something open within her, a space where curiosity began to bloom beside bitterness. By the time the sun sank that evening, the women no longer laughed quite as sharply when the hot dogs appeared. They still whispered their insults, still clung to pride, but their hands reached out quickly now. Marta watched them, torn between resistance and surrender, and knew she could not escape the truth forever. The food was changing them, not in body alone but in spirit. And though she did not yet know what it meant, she felt the first threads of transformation tightening around her, pulling her toward something she had not asked for but could no longer ignore. Marta awoke before dawn, her body restless though the camp remained quiet. The July air was thick with humidity, the kind that clung to skin and made breathing heavy. She sat upright on her cot, staring at the rows of sleeping women around her. Their breaths rose and fell in uneven rhythm, some muttering in their sleep, others curled tightly as if guarding themselves from invisible threats. Marta pressed her palms to her knees, remembering the taste of the hot dog from the previous evening. It was absurd that such a small, simple food could preoccupy her thoughts, yet it lingered in her memory with the stubbornness of a hymn half forgotten but impossible to silence. The days that followed had a rhythm. Morning roll call, chores around the camp, the sharp bark of orders in English half understood, and now, more often than not, the appearance of the hot dogs on the grill. What had begun as a novelty for the Americans became a ritual. Each time, the women's resistance weakened. They no longer mocked quite so loudly. Their insults had become a mask worn out of habit rather than conviction. The central conflict, between dignity and hunger, pride and survival, played out in every bite and no one could pretend otherwise. Marta noticed herself changing in ways she did not want to admit. She had grown used to the sight of Private Callahan, his sleeves rolled, his face flushed from the heat of the fire. At first she regarded him as she would any guard, an obstacle, a reminder of her captivity. Yet he lingered in her mind now, not because of his authority but because of his peculiar attempts at kindness. He teased the women gently, pantomimed joy as he devoured the food, and often placed the tray before Marta with a nod as though offering her something far greater than scraps. She despised the thought that he might matter to her in any way, but each time she accepted the food, she felt the fragile thread of connection tighten. The camp itself bore the marks of transformation. Tension had not vanished, it still lay in the cold stares of certain guards, in the stubborn refusal of some women to speak, but there was less hostility. Laughter, once rare and bitter, began to surface. Marta even caught herself laughing one afternoon when Erika dropped her hot dog onto her lap and cursed with a string of words so colorful that even Callahan, who did not understand them fully, laughed until tears filled his eyes. It was dangerous, this laughter. It softened edges that captivity demanded remain sharp. One evening after the meal, Marta found herself sitting apart from the others beneath the shade of the fence. The heat of the day was fading, and the sky had begun to glow with the faint colors of dusk. She pulled her knees to her chest and closed her eyes, listening. Beyond the fence, an American radio crackled faintly, playing a tune she did not know. The sound mingled with the distant laughter of guards and the soft chewing of the women finishing their food. It was in that moment that Callahan appeared, balancing a plate with one last hot dog. "You did not take yours," he said in his uneven German. He crouched down, the plate extended toward her. Marta hesitated. "I have eaten enough." He shrugged, settling onto the ground beside her, close enough that she caught the scent of smoke on his uniform. "You always say that." She looked at him, then really looked. His youth startled her. He could not have been older than 20, his eyes too unguarded for someone in uniform. He smiled at her with a kind of unstudied ease, and she felt her chest tighten. She hated that she could not place him neatly in her mind as enemy. "Why do you care if we eat?" she asked quietly. Callahan tilted his head as though the question puzzled him. "Because you are people. Hungry people." He took a bite of the hot dog himself, chewing thoughtfully, then added, "Back home we eat these at baseball games, fairs, the 4th of July. It is normal. Normal." The word struck her harder than she expected. She had almost forgotten what normal meant. In her world, food had been ration cards, cues stretching around corners, the clatter of spoons scraping empty bowls. Normal had been fear, the drone of bombers, the whistle of air raid sirens. Normal had been loss. Marta turned away, but the image of Callahan chewing his hot dog with boyish casualness refused to leave her. She thought of Liesel's tears when she had confessed the taste made her feel full, and she understood it now. The food was more than sustenance. It was a doorway, however small, into a reality she had been denied. That night she dreamed of her family. She saw her mother standing in their kitchen, flour dusting her hands, rolling bread that cracked at the edges from scarcity of ingredients. She saw her brothers, faces hollow with hunger, wolfing down potatoes boiled until they dissolved into mush. Then, against all logic, the dream shifted, and her mother was handing her a hot dog wrapped in soft bread, smiling as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Marta woke with tears on her cheeks, both ashamed and comforted by the image. The conflict deepened within her. She wanted to cling to her disdain, to remind herself of the destruction America's bombs had brought. Yet she could not erase the sight of the guards celebrating, their easy laughter, the taste of food that warmed her from within. Every bite undermined the narrative she had built to protect herself, and every glance from Callahan pushed further at the walls she had erected. The women noticed her silence, her distraction. Erika teased her one morning, suggesting she was falling in love with the hot dogs, or worse, with the guard who served them. The other women laughed, but Marta flushed hot with anger. It was a cruel joke, yet its sting came not from the insult but from the uncomfortable truth buried inside it. By the end of July, the ritual had transformed into expectation. The women no longer wondered if hot dogs would appear, they waited for them. And with each passing day, Marta felt her resentment shifting into something harder to define. The enemy was still the enemy, yet the boundaries blurred. Dignity still mattered, but pride no longer tasted as strong as bread fresh from the grill. One afternoon, as she bit into her hot dog, Marta caught Callahan watching her again. She held his gaze this time, her jaw set, as if daring him to interpret her silence. He only smiled and raised his bun slightly in a toast. She lowered her eyes, but not before she felt something stir in her chest, a recognition that frightened her more than any weapon. The hot dogs had become more than food. They had become symbols of contradiction, captivity and generosity, humiliation and comfort, despair and the faintest glimmer of hope. For Marta, they embodied the central conflict of her existence in that camp, the struggle to reconcile what she had believed with what she now experienced. It was not a battle fought with guns or walls, but with taste, memory, and reluctant acknowledgement. As the sun set behind the barbed wire that evening, Marta swallowed the last bite slowly, her throat tight. She did not yet know where this path would lead, but she sensed it was no longer possible to return unchanged. And as the faint crack of laughter from the guards drifted through the humid air, she realized with dread and curiosity alike that the next transformation was already waiting. The summer dragged on, and with it, the quiet rhythm of captivity grew strangely familiar. Each day the women lined up for their meals, each evening the smell of smoke drifted across the camp, each night Marta lay awake listening to the distant murmur of guards sharing stories in a language she only half understood. What had begun with ridicule had softened into something else, something harder to name. Even Erika, once the fiercest mocker, no longer called the hot dogs dog slop aloud. She ate them with the same hungry determination as the rest, though her pride compelled her to roll her eyes and mutter complaints for form's sake. The truth was written plainly on their faces. They wanted what was offered, even as it unsettled them. Marta had become the quiet center of the conflict, though she had never asked to be. The women watched her closely now, for she had resisted longest and spoke least. When she finally began to accept the hot dogs without hesitation, they took it as silent permission to do the same. Yet Marta herself felt no victory in this surrender. Each bite still carried the weight of contradiction. The taste was pleasant, the fullness in her stomach undeniable, but every swallow forced her to confront a world where the enemy's abundance revealed her homeland's ruin. She felt caught between two truths: loyalty to memory and the undeniable reality of the present. Private Callahan had become a constant presence. He lingered more often than other guards, sharing small jokes, offering exaggerated compliments on their German, even attempting once to teach them a bawdy American song that ended with the women laughing despite themselves. He remained a puzzle to Marta. He treated them not as enemies but as people, and that confounded her most of all. His crooked grin had a way of disarming her, leaving her uncertain whether to despise him or allow herself to see the humanity in his gestures. She had been trained by war to divide the world into us and them, yet Callahan blurred that line with each tray he carried. One evening, as the women ate under a violet sky streaked with the last light of day, Marta noticed Liesel again. The young woman sat with her hands folded around the bun, tears streaming down her cheeks, not of sorrow this time but of something softer. She whispered to no one in particular, "I feel full again." The words silenced the group. Marta's gaze lingered on her, and in that fragile confession she felt the whole weight of their shared condition. Hunger had stripped them of illusions, and fullness, no matter how it came, felt like a kind of grace. But grace came with its own dangers. Rumors swirled in the barracks. Whispers that the women were becoming too comfortable, that their dignity was eroding, that they were losing themselves in small pleasures while their homeland still smoldered in ruins. Erika, unable to resist the urge to wound, turned to Marta one night and asked, "Do you think your brothers would be proud watching you eat like this? Smiling at an American guard while he feeds you scraps?" The word struck hard. Marta said nothing, but her silence was heavy and all felt its weight. She lay awake that night, replaying Erika's accusation until dawn, her pride and shame tangling into knots. The climax of the conflict arrived on another sweltering afternoon when the guards prepared more hot dogs than usual. The women gathered eagerly, their restraint worn thin by routine. Callahan balanced two trays and moved along the line, handing out buns with his usual careless grin. When he reached Marta, he paused, holding one out with deliberate care. She took it, but Erika's voice cut through the moment. "Look at her," Erika sneered loudly. "Our proud nurse of Cologne, now no different than a child begging sweets from a stranger. Tell me, Marta, will you thank him in English when you're done?" The words hung in the air like smoke. The women froze, torn between hunger and shame, laughter and discomfort. Callahan looked from Erika to Marta, confusion clouding his grin. Marta felt heat rise to her face. She wanted to retort, to wound Erika with equal cruelty, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she did something unexpected. She raised the hot dog deliberately, held Erika's gaze, and took a slow, unflinching bite. The act silenced the yard. Pride, scorn, shame, all seemed to collapse in that single gesture. Marta chewed with steady defiance, swallowed, and said evenly, "Better this than starving." Her voice carried a weight that none could mock. Even Erika, for all her sharp tongue, looked away. For Marta, that bite was more than food. It was a decision. She would no longer pretend that survival was disgrace. She would no longer guard her pride so fiercely that it denied her reality. She could not change the war's outcome, could not undo her losses, but she could claim the simple truth that life, even in captivity, still offered moments worth taking. Callahan's expression softened. He gave a small nod as though he understood, though no words passed between them. The other women, emboldened by Marta's defiance, began to eat as well, no longer hiding their hunger behind insults. The yard filled with chewing, laughter, and the low hum of conversation. What had once been a scene of mockery had become something else entirely, a reluctant communion. As the sun dipped behind the barbed wire, Marta felt the tension in her chest ease for the first time in months. She knew the war had not ended within her. She still carried grief, bitterness, and questions that would never be answered. Yet she also carried the memory of taste, of fullness, of the strange truth that the enemy's food had given her back a piece of herself she thought she had lost. The conflict was not erased, but it had transformed. She could hold her pride and still accept nourishment. She could hate what had been done to her homeland and still acknowledge the humanity of the boy who handed her bread. That night, fireworks cracked faintly in the distance. The guards cheered, their voices rising into the humid air. The women listened from behind the fence, the explosions reminding them of bombs and firestorms, yet now carrying a different timbre. Marta sat among them, chewing the last bite slowly, and thought how strange it was that history could shift not with speeches or treaties but with something as small as food shared across enemy lines. She closed her eyes, letting the sound of fireworks blend with the fading laughter of the camp. The taste still lingered on her tongue, sweet and smoky, absurdly comforting. She understood then that survival was not measured in pride alone but in the quiet courage to accept what was given, to find humanity where none was expected, and to let even the simplest of meals remind her that she was still alive. The hot dog had begun as dog slop, a subject of ridicule. It ended as a symbol of survival, of reluctant kinship, of the fragile but undeniable truth that enemies could share more than hatred. For Marta, it became something greater still, a reminder that hope, like hunger, found its way through even the strongest defenses. And with that thought, she lifted her face to the night sky, where sparks of light bloomed and vanished, and allowed herself, for the first time in years, to feel not only full but quietly, dangerously human.